Welcome to Indus Special. I am Ejaz Haider. The sixth round of Doha peace talks between United States and Taliban negotiators ended yesterday. Sohail Shaheen, the Taliban's political spokesman in Doha, said in a tweet on Thursday that positive and constructive negotiations were held during the talks, adding that both sides would meet again for another round of discussions. Both sides listened to each other with care and patience, Shaheen said. Earlier on Sunday, Shaheen had told the AFP news agency that negotiations were stumbling over the fundamental question of when foreign forces would depart Afghanistan. While the US Embassy in Kabul did not immediately comment, the US Peace Envoy, Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad, who was leading negotiations on behalf of Washington, later tweeted saying, "Just concluded a round of talks in Doha. We made steady but slow progress on aspects of the framework for ending the Afghan war. We are getting into the nitty-gritty. The devil is always in the details. However, the current pace of talks isn't sufficient when so much conflict rages and innocent people die. We need more and faster progress. Our proposal for all sides to reduce violence also remains on the table." The US has said it will not agree to any withdrawal of troops as part of an eventual peace deal until the Taliban put in place security guarantees, implement a ceasefire, and sign off on other commitments, including an intra-Afghan dialogue with the Kabul government and other Afghan representatives. The Taliban insists they will not do any of these things until the US announces a withdrawal timeline. They also refuse to negotiate with Kabul, calling the Afghan government a puppet of the West. During the latest round of talks, which came nearly 2 months after an earlier bout of 16-day-long discussions, violent attacks in Afghanistan continued. On Wednesday, a Taliban suicide bomber and 4 gunmen attacked the Kabul office of Counterpart International, a non-profit group working with marginalized people in Afghanistan, killing 9 people and wounding at least 20 others. The attack came on the heels of a large peace summit in Kabul last week, where Afghan President Ashraf Ghani offered the Taliban a ceasefire to begin on the first day of Ramadan. The group has refused the offer. To discuss what progress might have been made, whether there is any possibility of an each ceasefire like last year, how far are the two sides from finding some modus vivendi as far as the sticking points are concerned, we have with us Sedney, who's a senior associate at CSIS, who's also a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asia. And we also have with us Mariam Wardak from Kabul. She's an analyst and also a peace and social activist. Let me begin with Mariam, who is on the ground. Mariam, what do you make of the latest round of talks? And also, of course, as I said, the fact that violence continues unabated and the Taliban have refused a ceasefire offer from President Ghani.
Well, I feel that the talks are beneficial for the United States and the Taliban, but the talks are not beneficial to the Afghan people. The recent attack was a given incident on how disappointing the Afghan public is regarding what's going on with the talks. I think that the United States should have immediately put their foot down with the Taliban and state that they do not want any violence to continue. I mean, how can you talk to them while their statements is that they're fighting foreigners in Afghanistan, and they're fighting the soldiers, the Afghan soldiers who are assisted, supported, and taught by the foreign soldiers. So I don't understand how you can sit at a table face to face with the enemy. Yes, the Americans are not losing lives at those incidents. It's the Afghans that are losing lives. So I feel like the Afghans feel that they have the short end of the stick. The Afghans are disappointed. I must also say that Afghans are also disappointed with the Afghan government. But the statement that Khalilzad mentioned about all sides needs to end conflict, the government is not going after the Afghan people. They're going after insurgents. That's the mandate of any government security officials, to go after insurgents that's going to bring harm to their own civilians and their own citizens. So I think that tweet was, that message that he had sent out through Twitter was it was not received very well with the Afghan public or the government or the civil society.
Okay, so without prejudice to what you're saying, I understand where you're coming from. But here's the thing. There is the desirable and then there's the doable. Now, the desirable would have been, for instance, 17 years down the line, there should have been no insurgency. The Afghan government should have been in control of its territory. The Afghan government should have had better economic opportunities for the people of Afghanistan. The Afghan refugees should have largely been repatriated, etc., etc. It's a long list. That's the desirable. But that has not happened. And because that has not happened, because there is an insurgency, because the Afghan government cannot control a large part of its territory, because the appetite for the foreign powers in Afghanistan is diminishing in relation to how long they can stay there or how long they can fill the coffers of the Afghan government. So the Trump administration has decided to, okay, let's talk and get out. And therefore, that gives the Taliban, the insurgent force, an upper hand. So I want your analysis, not just on the basis of what is desirable, but what is doable.
Well, Ejaz, we have to take a minute and we have to reflect. One, any Islamist militants are playing the long game. So we cannot ignore the past. If we want to be productive and we want to be efficient, we have to reflect on what happened. First of all, when the Bonn conference had taken place, the United States did not want the Taliban on the table because it benefited them, because they were looking for Osama bin Laden, because they felt that the Taliban were a threat. All of a sudden, the threats to the United States are gone, so now they want to talk to the Taliban. So maybe a little reflection. Maybe if the U.S. government would apologize and say, we made the wrong move here, but still have some sort of representation of the Afghan public, if not the Afghan government. I am not going to reflect that the Afghan government is on par. When we're talking about ground, how much territory that the government is holding, we also need to reflect that much of the territory is empty land. There are no civilians, there are no people living there. So we can't give the Taliban any type of recognition that they're holding the majority of the land. No, that is not accurate. Secondly, yes, the Taliban have an upper hand. Why? Because they're in it for the long game. They will continue to fight. And they have other foreign nations that are helping them financially. The Afghan government is doing everything by paper. They're communicating with, and they're meeting certain benchmarks. The Taliban are not. They're getting as much money as they want to do what they want. So, of course, we're not going to, the Afghan government will not have the upper hand. The militants would be. But we also need to highlight how wrong they are if they are fighting because they want
Mariam, once again, as I said earlier, I know where you're coming from, but here's the problem. It's not just about highlighting something. It's about resolving something. And there is an actual situation on the ground. And that situation has not redounded to the advantage either of the government in Kabul or, shall I say, the US-led support mission. So when we juxtapose these realities, the only thing that we can come up with is to talk to the Taliban. And when we say that that's the only reality moving forward, then of course we also have to realize that the reason this side is now talking to the Taliban is because they have not won. And the Taliban have won by not really losing. That's the reality on the ground.
I completely agree with you. But the reality of on the ground is that you cannot ignore the Afghan public. You cannot communicate with them. The Taliban, if they do not want to talk to the government, I totally understand. But you have to speak to the Afghan public.
Okay, Mariam, that's a point that I'll come back to. But I think I need to pull in David Sedney here because you said that the Americans should have apologized for making mistakes, and of course the fact that it's the Trump administration that is talking to the Taliban, and there's also been a lot of criticism, as you've also implied, that the Kabul government has also been shut out, and so have been the Afghan people. David Sedney.
Well, I think Mariam is very correct. The purpose of peace talks is to achieve a lasting, durable peace. As you said, the United States has not won, but the Taliban have also not won. 20 years ago, the Taliban controlled all of Afghanistan. Today, as Mariam said, they control some territory, but actually not a very high percentage of the people. So treating this as a negotiation between the Taliban who have won and international forces who have lost will not lead to a durable, sustainable peace. A durable, sustainable peace must be reached between the Afghans and include those who support them, including Pakistan, which has supported the Taliban. So these peace talks that are going on right now are only partial in nature. And the longer they go on without the Afghan government being directly involved, without the Afghan people involved, the less likely it is they will lead to a durable peace. It is not impossible to have a bad peace. In the 1980s, the United States and the Soviet Union negotiated a withdrawal agreement for Soviet forces over the head of the Afghan people and the Afghan government. That prepared the grounds for a Soviet withdrawal. The result of that was incredible devastation, a civil war, the emergence of Al-Qaeda. So a bad peace in 1988 and 89 led to an even worse situation after that. So if we see a bad peace coming out of this because of bad assumptions and bad procedures, things could be even worse 5 years from now. And I think we do need to keep the eye on the long run. And Mariam is absolutely right. The Afghan people and Afghan government need to be part. And I would go further and say every session without them makes a durable peace less likely.
Okay, I'm assuming here that you are not particularly keen on the way in which the Trump administration is approaching the issue of Afghanistan, including, of course, the fact that you seem to imply that without taking the Kabul government on board and also bringing the Afghan stakeholders, other civilian, civil society and political opposition and the rest of them into the loop, this particular way of dialoguing with the Taliban is not going to be advantageous.
It's not going to lead to a durable peace. If you have an agreement that leads to a worse situation, then you have failed in peace negotiations. Just because you are talking doesn't mean you will have success. There have been lots of situations and other insurgencies around the world and other conflicts between states around the world where peace talks have failed. So it's important for the United States to do a good job. And so far, the United States and the Taliban have failed to lay the basis for a sustainable peace.
Okay, so what would you, David, let me ask a specific question. What would you suggest if you were to decide how to go about it? Give me a prescription here.
Well, the Afghan government and the Afghan people need to be included in a direct way now. If the Taliban won't sit down with them at the table, you can do things such as proximity talks, which were held during the Northern Ireland resolution, before the Good Friday Accords in Northern that laid the basis for a resolution of Northern Ireland. The two sides never met directly. They didn't have an intra-Irish dialogue. What they had were a series of proximity talks where the United States and others shuttled between the two sides.
Okay, so that's a very interesting, that's a very good example. But are you saying that the talks should continue, but that the U.S. should absolutely insist that there should be a dialogue between the Taliban and the Kabul government through proximity talks? Is that what you're suggesting?
I'm suggesting that is one possible way forward.
Okay, one possible way.
But the talks should continue. The United States should work with the Taliban and make sure the Taliban really want peace. I think that goes to the heart of what Mariam was saying, but I don't want to speak for her. The question that was raised by the attack on Counterpart International, a civilian NGO, by the Taliban, raises a question: do the Taliban really want peace? Because if what the Taliban want is a U.S. with complete withdrawal and an Afghan surrender and the recreation of the Islamic Emirate of the 1990s, that is not going to happen. There will be civil war. There will be more, not less people dying if that is their goal.
I totally agree that this is what in social sciences would be called a wicked problem. But the issue is that so far the US has not been able to get the Taliban to agree to certain things. And the Taliban have said that you first give us the withdrawal timeline. And once you've given the withdrawal timeline, which is, I think, that's where they're going to make a sales pitch to their fighters on the ground, that we have managed to do what we tried to do in the last 17 years. And once that happens, And of course, they're front loading it, but that once that happens, then they will actually talk about other guarantees and agree to perhaps then also talking to a larger group of Afghan stakeholders.
If a separate agreement was reached and it was that was all there was, then you would not have a stable agreement. Ambassador Khalilzad, I think, has very correctly said that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed.
Correct.
So therefore, a partial agreement, as I said, would lead to more war, not less. So the challenge for the negotiators, both the U.S. and the Taliban say they want peace, but so far they've not acted like that. The challenge for both sides is to have a peace talks that lead to a sustainable peace. And right now, we're not on the road to that. And that is the responsibility of both the Americans and the Taliban and the government of Qatar and the government of Pakistan and all the others that are involved. This is not just the responsibility of the U.S.
Okay.
And I think the U.S., China, and Russia, if you look at the contents of the statement that the three countries signed in Moscow, they made very clear to the Taliban what the Taliban have to do, and so far the Taliban have not done it.
Okay. Mariam, I was looking at your Twitter timeline, and there was a very interesting clip there about a red line. And there were these girl students who talked about what the red line for them is. I'm assuming that that is also sort of symbolic of the emphasis of women's role in Afghanistan, which is also a matter of deep concern to the women in Afghanistan and around the world in relation to the possibility of the Taliban coming into some kind of, or becoming part of some kind of power configuration in Kabul. Am I assuming that correctly?
Before I enter the gender aspect of reintegrating the Taliban into Afghanistan, I want to highlight something to David and the world who's watching, is that one of the successes that have led to the current phase of negotiation was the South Asia strategy. We don't give that strategy enough credit as much as we should. And I think that that was probably one of the most successful strategies that I have ever come across while involved in Afghanistan. But one of the things that the United States is falling short on is actually acting like a real ally to the Afghans, as the Afghans have acted for the Americans. We allowed the Americans to come in to find Osama bin Laden, but it seems like it was such a self-beneficial a strategy for them that right when they found that, okay, elections are coming, there's no need for it come, terrorism continues to be a threat. And the reason why it's because it's a phenomenon and it's worked as a proxy and nobody knows who's actually behind it. So I think that we need to keep that in mind. Going to the gender aspect, when you go to the provinces, one of the things that everybody is following is social media and really empowering women's voice when it comes to negotiations. I would like the Americans and whoever's at the talks to understand that first we need to highlight the term. Are we in talks? Are we in negotiations? Or are we in dialogues? Because they have different meanings. So if we're in negotiations, yes, women should have a voice. So my video was actually the basics that women want. Women want an access to education. Women want access to healthcare. Women don't want war anymore. Girls don't want war anymore because they don't want to be orphaned. Now, when you go to the villages, the reason why I approach this a basics, because when I would travel to the villages, the mothers, the grandmothers, the daughters, they wanted more basics. And the reason why they wanted basic is because many of their sons were involved in the Taliban and they missed, and they didn't want to fight for anything more. They wanted their son to return home, but they also didn't want to handicap the future of their daughters. Now, the political elites want women to be at the table, but one of the concerns that I have is that I've been having a number of surveys on my social media, and I've been asking if women currently in the Afghan government role is symbolic or not, and there was about 270 responses, and 65% said that the role was symbolic. So my concern is, if we have women at the front seat, is this going to be symbolic or is it actually going to be operative? So we need to look at the dynamic. Of course, being symbolic and having a woman at the table is still progress of some sort, but I don't want some sort of progress. If we're going to be negotiating, we need to have certain terms and accept it. If they're going to be terms based on Islamic beliefs and rules, then we need to have female religious scholars there arguing on our behalf. So it looks positive to me. I think so, because one of the people that the Taliban had reached out to come to the talks was Fatima Gilani, and she was the former spokesperson for the Mujahideen, and she is the daughter of one of the religious, former religious leaders. He passed away, Pir Gilani. So I think the Taliban are open to having women in certain roles, but it's about how we approach it and how we strategize.
I think that you put it very clearly, because I read your mother's article in one of the U.S. newspapers where she talked about being a woman and why she thinks it's important to talk to the Taliban, and also the fact that there's the parliament and the upper echelons of the society where women in the last 17 years we've seen their presence. But there are also conservative societal attitudes, and if I remember correctly, I think it was back in 2015, where a crowd lynched a woman in Kabul, not even somewhere in the countryside, but in the city. And I think that is something which reflects regressive attitudes that still persist in certain sections of the society. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it was actually Farkhunda's murder. She was 1 mile outside of the presidential palace, and an angry mob had killed her. Just recently, 3 weeks ago, a girl was not wearing a scarf at Kabul University, and she was beaten by the men. And just at the peace jirga, consultative peace jirga, some of the men made really negative comments towards women, not allowing them to speak. And one man actually told the woman that you need to be at the kitchen. You should not be here. You have no role here. So yes, we do have certain traditional ways of beliefs that women should have certain roles within the home and not outside. But I think with generations that will change, because if the grandfather speaks like that, I think the grandson doesn't have that kind of a conservative mindset. But again, like I said, we need to approach it very strategically. So if the majority of the public is going to want women to advance, but through religious actions and beliefs, then we need to have female religious scholars there. One of the criticisms that I openly made of the delegation, that the 250 person delegation that President Ghani had listed, is that we didn't have one female religious scholar in that delegation, and I was extremely disappointed. My recommendation was to send 50 women, make sure the majority of them are religious scholars, and others in specific fields like medicine, education, so then we can argue logically and not emotionally. Unfortunately, I see that many of the people who are approaching these negotiations, it's based on emotions and not logic. And I think that's where our shortcomings are here.
That's a very interesting point, and I'm going to return to this point, but I'm also joined by Ambassador Asif Durrani, who's a former Foreign Service officer. He joins me from Quetta. Thank you, Ambassador Durrani. We're discussing the latest round of Doha negotiations between the U.S. and the Taliban, and there's some reports suggest that some progress has been made, but we don't really know what exactly that is. And there are, of course, the sticking points about the Taliban asking for a withdrawal timeline before they would agree to certain other guarantees, and perhaps also talk to the Afghan civil society activists and political opposition, and then perhaps also to people within the government. What is your reading of this latest round?
I think this Doha round is now the sixth round, and during the past 8 months, these parleys have been going on. There is some progress because if you look back, say 1 year ago, the Americans, they were not ready to talk to the Taliban. But now I think they have taken Taliban as a stakeholder. But the unfortunate part is that President Ashraf Ghani's government is missing from these parleys, and I think Taliban will have to look at that at some stage, because they are not the center of the universe, and they will have to take into account all Afghan society. So it has to be an inclusive dialogue. So far, it is a two-way dialogue between Taliban and the Americans, and the intra-Afghan dialogue has yet to take place, in which all stakeholders, in Afghanistan, they are to participate. And right now they are discussing on two major aspects, which is American withdrawal and Taliban guarantee that Afghan soil will not be used against by the terrorists. But the two other major points, which are intra-Afghan dialogue and cessation of hostilities, cessation.
The ceasefire,
that has to be that has to see some progress. It has not taken place. So overall, there is hope, but at the same time, there is some pessimism because it's not moving to that head. And in this regard, you might have also witnessed that bloodbath is taking place, attacks are taking place in Afghanistan, and innocent people are being killed by both sides. So this needs to be taken very seriously if peace and stability in Afghanistan is sought by the parties.
Ambassador Durrani, you talked about the inclusive talks, and I agree with you. But one of the criticisms is, in the way these negotiations are being taken forward, is that the Kabul government has been shut out from this, and as is the Afghan civil society and also the political opposition. And I'm talking about the Doha round. Although in Moscow, the Taliban delegation did meet with Afghan civil society activists and also the political opposition. But one of my guests on the program, David Sedney, who's also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Afghanistan, Pakistan and Central Asia, reminded me of the idea of proximity talks. And he said that the US should insist that the Taliban should talk to the representatives of the Afghan government and perhaps other Afghan civil society representatives through the framework of proximity talks. Do you think that is a workable idea?
Well, anything is workable, but let me say it here clearly. It is the United States which actually bypassed the Afghani government, and they took Taliban. And then it is unfortunate on the part of the Afghani government that they cannot offer guarantees that the Afghan soil will not be used by the terrorists. It is the Taliban who are considered by the United States as credible partners to offer such guarantees. So here you can say, you can very well see how the situation is there on the ground. So proxy talks could be held, and I think when Afghani government will finalize the list of those interlocutors, because earlier they had proposed almost 250 names for that list. So the Taliban said it is we are not going to a marriage party, but
what they said.
We want to have interlocutors.
Absolutely.
So I think there has to be some seriousness. And since 250 names were said, this is was because the Ashraf Ghani government didn't want to annoy anyone. They wanted to include anyone, and since the elections are to be held by September, if at all those are held. So, so he had that in mind.
Absolutely.
So there are many, you can say, confusions within the Afghan ranks. Whether you talk about the Ashraf Ghani camp, or his NUG, National Unity Government, or the opposition, which
absolutely, there are lots of fissures between the within the Kabul government and also between the Kabul government and the political opposition. Thank you so much. Ambassador Asif Durrani was talking to us. David Sedney, it's deeply ironic. I mean, Ambassador Durrani raised this point, which I think is very interesting and ironic also, that the US is asking the Taliban to give them guarantees that the Afghan soil will not be used against the United States or the US allies, because these guarantees cannot be given by the Kabul government. This in and of itself is a concession to the fact that in any future dispensation, this is the kind of thing that will be decided by the Taliban rather than by the dispensation that actually came into existence on the basis of post-US invasion constitution and post-US invasion political dispensation in Afghanistan.
With apologies, I think you have it a little bit wrong there. What the U.S. is asking for is the Taliban to break ties with terrorists, including Al-Qaeda, and to refuse to cooperate with them at all. That goes back to the very beginning of this war. The reason why this happened, the Taliban gave haven to the Al-Qaeda. They continued to support the Al-Qaeda. In the negotiations after the attack on the World Trade Center, the United States repeatedly asked the Taliban to break ties.
I totally agree with. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that what it implies is that because the Taliban could not be defeated, it's now the U.S. again asking the Taliban for guarantees because they're not sure what kind of dispensation. Because if it were a dispensation that was, friendly to the United States, the U.S. would not be asking an insurgent force to give them guarantees that the Afghan soil will not be used for attacks against the United States.
Play any role in the future of Afghanistan or the future of the region, they have to break with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups and refuse to support them. And so that is an important part of any progress for the Taliban to be part of the future of Afghanistan. The fact that the Taliban are willing to talk about it is positive, I guess. But also, I point out, so far the Taliban have not been willing to do that. They've not made a statement.
Because they are also, because there's also some problem with, as they said in the previous round, with the definition of terrorist and terrorism. But thank you so much, David Sedney, for giving us your insights. And before I wrap up, let me go back to Mariam Wardak. Mariam, you said something very interesting. I wanted to come back to that about women religious scholars. Now, generally, and it's not just in Afghanistan, it's also in Pakistan and elsewhere in the Muslim majority countries, that the liberal enclaves generally try to play on a pitch which is very different from that of the religious side. But I see that given your practical work on the ground, you seem to understand the imperative of trying to get some kind of, common ground between those who, how should I put it? I don't really want to use the word liberal, but those who look at modernity in a certain way, but also believe that tradition and modernity are part of the same continuum.
You see, I think that women in Afghanistan are, there was a speech that I had given a few months ago, are women in transition between tradition and modernity. See, we modernize tradition. The problem on the ground in Afghanistan is culture versus religion. It's cultural practices versus religion. So when something oppresses a female culturally and female wants to rise, then they use religion. So I feel that if we have women who can communicate term by term, especially female religious scholars, because they will know verses, they will know how to articulate properly, to make a strong ground argument for women to advance, whether it's in education and medicine, etc. Now, I ask for women in specific fields, women medical doctors, female in education, in engineering, in maths. And why I think that they need to be there is because arguing with actual technocrats is much different than arguing with politicians. Politicians look at their own benefits. Technocrats look at the best of the society in that specific field, whether it's math, medicines, or female religious scholars.
But the politicians, Mariam, but the politicians also have the very unsavory task of aggregating very often conflicting and contradictory interests. That's something that the technocrats don't have to do.
That's why I'm saying politicians are not trusted. Politicians are not trusted by the public, and they're definitely not going to be trusted by the Taliban, because the Taliban are here, and they know that they're here for one agenda, either the agenda of the presidential election to get us some sort of seat. But when you have female technocrats there for specific reasons, science, medicine, religious scholars, they will argue on that fact, and they will not allow emotions or culture or forms of modernity to get in place. They will just look at what needs to be advanced in what way and what's best for the society. And I think that we as an Afghans, the Afghan public needs to understand that if this is a negotiation, there are certain things that we need to give up as well. It can't be the Taliban only. It must be the public as well. So it's best to take technocrats to go and have a discussion versus any other politician.
Okay,
and
I have to wrap up now. We could have another program on this idea of politicians versus technocrats, because I have a slightly different take on that. But thank you so much, Mariam Wardak. More power to you for being with us. We shall take a break and move on to discuss joint drills by 4 countries in the contested South China Sea. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. In fresh show of naval force in the contested South China Sea, a U.S. guided missile destroyer conducted drills with a Japanese aircraft carrier, 2 Indian naval ships, and a Philippine patrol vessel in the waterway claimed by China, the U.S. Navy said on Thursday. While similar exercises have been held in the South China Sea in the past, the combined display by 4 countries represents a fresh challenge to Beijing as U.S. President Donald Trump threatens to hike tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. Professional engagements with our allies, partners, and friends in the region are opportunities to build upon our existing strong relationships. Commander Andrew J. Klug, the captain of the U.S. destroyer, the USS William P. Lawrence, said in a statement, Japan sent one of its 2 big aircraft carriers, the Izumo, while India deployed a destroyer, the INS Kolkata, and a tanker, the INS Shakti. From Pakistan's perspective, 2 developments are important: the U.S. Pacific Command becoming Indo-Pacific Command, and the close cooperation between the U.S. and India in countering China. However, India's rising ambition to develop and deploy a blue water navy in the Indian Ocean poses a direct security threat to Pakistan and its maritime interests. To discuss Indian ambition and Pakistan's options, we have with us Admiral Asif Hamayun. Thank you for being on the program, Admiral Hamayun. My first specific question: we know what the Indian ambition is, but here's the problem. We spend very little amount on our Navy. If I remember correctly, the last time we had a big ticket item was back in the 90s with the submarines. Do you think there is need for us to put in more money as far as our naval capabilities are concerned? Because we're not even, right now, we're not even a green water Navy, let alone a blue water Navy.
What I would say that, yes, Pakistan Navy is small, but at the moment, there are 3 major programs which are underway. As you may have heard, Pakistan Navy has signed a deal for 8 submarines with China. Yeah. We have also signed a deal for 4 destroyers from China, and we have also 4 ships on order from Turkey. So government is building Navy. But our ambition is not to contest India and South China Sea.
No, I didn't mean South China Sea. What I'm saying is that Indian cooperation with the U.S. and Indian ambition to evolve and develop a blue water Navy means forget about South China Sea or the Strait of Malacca and the rest of it, but we have our problem here because we have a conflictual model with India, and obviously if they develop their naval capabilities, then that becomes a problem for us.
Yes, it does, but our area of operations mostly is Arabian Sea, and in particular North Arabian Sea. And here we enjoy a geographical advantage because our bases are very close to the sea lanes of communication which are of interest to Pakistan, as well as was seen on last March, the first week of March, that at point of contact, our aircraft detected the Indian submarine, and we discussed that on your program. And the Indian submarine did not even know that it had been detected. And moreover, in the recent past, Pakistan Navy has demonstrated that it can very well guard its interests in the area in operation. But I agree with you, the Pakistan Navy needs beefing up. There is no doubt about that.
So we also know that India has a program for, it sends an SSBNs We have tested a submerged platform for our cruise missile, but clearly for a second strike capability, we have to move towards that capability. That's what the Indians. Luckily for us, they've managed to literally sink their Arihant because they couldn't manage to operate it properly, and they let water come into the submarine. But that has to do with the ions, incapability. But we still have to be very careful about how the Indians are developing certain capabilities and need to figure out what kind of ratios we have to maintain so that the strategies of coercion do not kick into play.
Okay, yes, I agree that Pakistan doesn't have a matching sea strike capability as far as nuclear-powered submarines are concerned. But at the same time, we have the Israeli model in front of us. Israel uses its conventional submarines to deploy its nuclear-tipped missiles and of about the similar range as our Babar missile. So eventually, Pakistan will acquire a nuclear-powered submarine, but that is in future. And it's as shown by India's example, it is not just acquiring a nuclear-powered capability, it is also its employment in terms of the crew professionalism, its continuous ability to prowl the sea, etc., etc. So these things take time, but at the moment, Pakistan does have second strike capability deployed on our conventional submarines, and we are not the first ones to deploy nuclear-tipped missiles on conventional submarines. That route was already taken by the Israelis.
Absolutely. But we agree that, of course, we know that we have resource constraints. We also know that our stated policy is not to be aggressors, but to be effective defenders of our territory, whether on land or in sea, but that we do need to have effective deterrent capability, and that is where we, in terms of the SSBN, that is where we have to move ultimately at some point.
Yeah, maybe if, first of all, Pakistan is a very resource-constrained country right now. Yeah. SSBN alone will require an investment of upward of $1 billion per platform, and to maintain them, etc., etc. We need to have a base. So it really is something for planners, and I'm sure something is being done about it right now. But I don't think that a 12 ballistic missile armed nuclear-powered submarine is will be available to Pakistan Navy in near future.
Absolutely.
Like the Indian ones.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Vice Admiral Asif Hamayun speaking with us in relation to Indian Navy's capabilities, India's ambition to develop and deploy a blue water navy, the fact that Pakistan has its own resource constraints, but that we do develop the capability in certain ways in order to ensure that the strategies of coercion do not kick into play. That's all from Indus Special this week. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.